So I'm pleased to be joined today by Kevin Outterson, a professor of law at Boston University, and Dr. Sam Orubu, a postdoctoral fellow also at Boston University, to discuss a paper that just came out in Clinical Infectious Diseases about antibiotic availability. Kevin, talk to me a little bit about how this paper came about and what you see are the key messages.
Well, John, you should also note that you're a co-author on this paper.
Yes.
Christine Årdal from Norway and Muhammad Zaman, also from the EU. But I remember when the Infectious Disease Society of America came out, probably in 2009, with their goal of let's have 10 new antibiotics in the following decade. They called it 10 by 20, and you may be involved in this effort. And I went back and looked, and we greatly exceeded that numerical target. We got 18 antibiotics, not 9 or not 10. But there's been a lot of concern in the community about, well, maybe these aren't the antibiotics we wanted or needed. And so that's one concern. But then I also think, from my vantage point at CARB-X, innovation that doesn't actually reach patients is worthless. And so I wanted to know how these antibiotics were being disseminated in the world. Obviously in poorer places around the world. But then I kept hearing stories from people that many of these antibiotics weren't actually being commercially launched even in high-income countries. And so I thought, let's look at the G7, the world's richest countries, and for good measure, 7 other high-income countries in Europe. So take these 14 rich countries, including places like the United States, Japan, and Canada, and many countries in Europe. And let's see how these antibiotics, fared. And so it's every antibiotic approved by the FDA, EMA, Health Canada, or Japan in that decade from 2010 to 2019. And
the results are pretty striking about the lack of access.
Right. The charts are just stunning. Canada, unfortunately, comes in last place with only 2 out of the 18 being commercially launched in Canada. Canadian patients have to rely on special access programs, and doctor calling someone and getting special permission and an antibiotic flying on an airplane and making, several days later sort of thing. Only 3 countries had a majority of these drugs actually commercially launched. And a number of countries in Europe had the marketing authorization. EMA had approved it. So technically you were all set to go. But apparently for these countries, it was still too expensive to do a commercial launch in Germany or Italy or Croatia or Sweden to justify going to that effort. The sales revenues were going to be so low that they couldn't even justify a commercial launch, despite the fact that they had an EMA-approved drug. And so that pointed to really, in my mind, very systemic global issues. If you can't get these drugs launched in Europe, in high-income countries, in the G7, what's the chance for Africa, South America, Asia? It's a global equity access issue as well as just an R&D nightmare.
Yeah. So, a criticism, and you mentioned a minute ago, is that maybe these antibiotics aren't all that cool. Maybe they're not all that innovative. But Sam, I know you spent a fair bit of time thinking about measures of innovation and whether these were antibiotics that were worth having. And the paper approaches that from a couple of different angles. Talk a little bit about how you thought about measures of innovation, and then what you learned when you looked at the antibiotics by whether they were or were not innovative.
So when we talk of measures of innovation, we use, like the paper mentioned, 2 reference sources, such that we can quote them. We use the Pew Charitable Trust, like you saw, and then the WHO measure. In all, we found 5 of these antibiotics to be classified as either WHO or Pew as innovative. In our own assessment, we did not delve into the rationale for assigning innovativeness. All we wanted to do was to tease out any difference whatsoever, if there were, between what's been categorized as innovative by some other group of people and what was not categorized as innovative. So it was simply a statistical investigation we wanted to do between these two groups rather than delving into the fine points or the definitions of in what constitutes innovation. And the results were in some way surprising, like the paper mentioned. You might expect in the context of antimicrobial resistance and the quest for new drugs, the drugs that were labeled as innovative might be more readily available at the market. But the results were counterintuitive in that regard.
Yeah, I even noticed for that you mentioned the Pew and the WHO categories, but you also looked at the essential medicines list, and there was an interesting sort of counterintuitive finding with that.
Yes, so the WHO, I think this, though it's counterintuitive, perhaps if we step back a bit and look at the process by which the WHO includes medicines in the essential medicines list, you will see on the part of the WHO an abundance of caution. In other words, they would generally, by and large, in the majority of cases, look for drugs that have established pharmacological data, so efficacy, safety, and all of that. But one of the main forces driving inclusion in the list is also this WHO concept of affordability. Is it affordable? Whichever way they mention that, on top of the safety and efficacy criteria, and as well as disease prevalence. So long story short, I think the process for getting a drug in the WHO list is not based necessarily on is the drug innovative on its own. It's a mix of different factors, and I reckon that will take time So any new drug will take time essentially to get into the WHO list. So the results demonstrate perhaps what we did not completely tease out in the paper. In other words, it does take time for medicines to get listed on the WHO essential medicines list. There are exceptions to these. For instance, in the current edition of the essential medicines list for children, there is a drug for oncology that is not yet widely known, but it's there in the list. So I think you could argue this either way. But I think the reason why we see this result is what I had explained prior to this, which is its affordability, efficacy, safety, and time sort of.
I hadn't thought about viewing it through that lens. What caught my eye was that one of your findings was that being on the EML actually predicted lack of accessibility in the high 14 income countries.
Yeah, and we can't say why that is. We don't know, but since we're not writing the paper now, I'm a little more free to speculate. The WHO has a system, the AWARE, the Access, Watch, and Reserve. Yeah. And of the antibiotics, it takes them a couple of years to put a new antibiotic into that list. But of the antibiotics out of the 18 that are so listed, all but one are in the reserve category. Now, this makes a world of sense. This is stewardship. Yeah. This is being careful with the new drugs. But the flip side of it is that if everyone is careful and no one commercially launches and hardly anyone uses it, yeah, and the patent period runs for 10 to 15 years and then it's over, how is the company ever going to make money in return that R&D? We've seen in many, the chart that was in the newsletter, the colored chart, we see many of these countries in which they still haven't launched a drug that's 7 or 8 years old. Yeah. And so, put another way, most of the patent period is gone before a drug ever reaches these high-income markets. So who actually is paying for the R&D? And the short answer is the United States is the first launch country for most of these drugs, and the UK and Sweden and a couple of others are the earlier adopters out of this list. And so it's a very narrow group of countries that are actually carrying the R&D burden. And it's hard then to match, who what market mechanism is there to help us develop a drug that could be uniquely helpful for Africa or Southeast Asia?
Right.
There's no market.
Nothing. Right. And that just leads us right into the whole push right now for pull incentives, and just not the day to go into that in greater detail. We've got lots of newsletters on that. We'll put some links up below for you to, if you want to read about the need for pull incentives. But it really does say that we have to think about paying differently. And by the way, Kevin, I know you've got a paper coming about how much we need to pay in order to have the antibiotics we want. Do you want to say anything about that? Is it almost out?
I've spent 2 years obsessing over this. So I've looked at every data source that one can find on the cost and time and chance of success at each stage of everything antibiotic. And I've tried to build a net present value model similar to what the Circaya did in the ERG study.
Yeah.
And yes, it's accepted for publication. I should be able to say more about that in the next 2 weeks, and maybe we'll come back and do one of these when that's out there. Yeah. But what I was trying to do there is to show whether or not the UK pilot and the US Pasteur Act, whether those are in the realm of plausible in order to solve the antibiotic R&D crisis. And the short answer is yes, they're both within the ranges that my study estimates, the effective ranges.
Good, excellent. So, Sam, is there any other major point from the paper that you'd want to highlight? What have we not talked about that we should have discussed?
The major takeaway from this paper with regards to antimicrobial agents being launched has been mentioned previously is the entire processes for making those drugs essentially available to patients. And then in this case, we find that, if you like, the rate limiting step is this very last step leading to launch. So you have approvals from drug regulatory authorities, but the product is not launched in countries. We did not completely explore the reasons for that, but several reasons have been adduced in the literature. And one of the things we felt that perhaps we didn't examine critically in this paper is the cost of the drug, because that's an essential component for this final stage of the launch, where countries do what they call health technology assessment, essentially a cost-benefit analysis. So the cost of the drug essentially, in many cases, determine whether they will include it in reimbursement plans. And associated to that in this cost-benefit equation is, do you have a drug for, do you have a prior drug for that condition? For instance, for CDI, do you have another drug for that condition? So the considerations for drug launches made by insurance companies perhaps need to be loosened up for antimicrobial agents. So I think that process in itself needs to be examined, and I think that's one key takeaway from the paper.
Yeah, it ties into the notion that, like the Circaya paper showed us, that antibiotics have near infinite value when you're about to die, right? But until that moment, they don't appear to have much value, and it's a really, really interesting paradox. So, Kevin, over to you for the final word. Closing thoughts.
So what Sam just said about cost, the cost of the drug needs to be affordable to people who need them. And Tim Walsh, from Oxford now, has been leading a bunch of studies, the Barnard study, and yet another one just appeared in Lancet Infectious Diseases. And they're actually looking at the cost effectiveness of antibacterial treatments for neonatal sepsis in many developing countries. Very interesting data. Yeah. But I have to say that, really low prices, which are necessary, for access, and really low volumes driven by stewardship equals bankruptcy for these right. companies. Right. And so this is why, you and I are always telling people that, a dealing solution like subscriptions, like what the United Kingdom is doing, like what Pasteur Act might do, which pays based on the value, not on the volume, is an elegant way out of this puzzle. We can't keep paying based on volumes if we want the volume low. And we can't charge $10,000 or $100,000 or $1 million for these drugs if we want the rest of the world to benefit. So subscriptions, once again, people get tired of hearing it from us, but it is a solution here. The other thing I'll say is that, I talked about how some companies aren't launching in countries in Europe, even though they have EMA authorization. We noted in the paper a couple of examples of companies that withdrew their EMA papers because they didn't see any future there. And if you looked at the data between the large companies and the small, the majority of the innovation is coming out of the small companies, but the majority of the commercial launches are coming out of the larger companies, which kind of says that the larger companies can take the longer view. They have more resources. And the smaller ones are just struggling. They have to make a real cash calculation about whether they're going to launch in country X, and what's the payback period of that. A big company can think about a longer payback period. These little companies that are short in cash, it's, who's helping me tomorrow? And so we have a serious global, this isn't a problem in the developing world. This is a global innovation patient access issue. We got to fix it, or else we're not going to have any new antibiotics.